On December 13th, 1836, in Chopin's elegant Paris apartment, he and Franz Liszt sat down at a piano just like this one, an 1830s Pleyel. Together, they performed this once popular four-hand piano sonata. This was Liszt's part, the primo at the top of the piano, where he got to play all the primary melodies and glittering runs. And this was Chopin's part, the secondo, where he controlled the pedals and the elaborate inner voices. The piano you're hearing is the very kind of instrument that Chopin and Liszt would have known in those days. I recorded this sonata on a modeled 1835 Pleyel by Pianotech to try and recreate what this performance might have sounded like. And by the way, Chopin and Liszt weren't just playing alone. They did so in front of a spectacular mix of celebrity musicians, famous novelists, high-profile politicians, and their girlfriends, or technically Liszt's mistress and Chopin's soon-to-be lover, a cross-dressing, cigar-smoking woman called Georges Sand. We know all of this happened because earlier that day, the Polish cellist Józef Brzowski received a note he would never forget. It was from his old school friend, Frédéric Chopin, who wrote, "Today I will have a few people at my place. Among others, Madame Sand. Besides, Liszt will play, Nourrit, a very famous tenor at the time, will sing. If this may be agreeable to Mr. Brzowski, I await him this evening." In other words, Chopin was throwing an A-lister party with celebrities of 1830s Paris, and Brzowski was invited. Luckily for us, he recorded every detail he remembered from that evening. The full story he told reveals a lot that isn't typically known about these famed musicians, including how they interacted with each other in private conversation, and no less how they played piano together. This is everything that happened at Chopin's star-studded Soirée in December of 1836. It was just 5 years earlier that Chopin had first arrived in Paris with little reputation to precede him, but he soon struck up a friendly relationship with Liszt. They had a lot in common, both generationally talented pianists and emerging composers in their early 20s, with Liszt about a year and a half younger than his Polish colleague. Liszt attended Chopin's debut recital at the Salle Pleyel in 1832, and the next year Chopin dedicated his Opus 10 piano studies to his friend J. Liszt. At least that's how it erroneously appeared in first editions. Around that time, they co-wrote a letter to a mutual friend, trading off lines as they presumably took turns playing piano. As Liszt played through the Opus 10 etudes, Chopin wrote that he wanted to steal his friend's interpretation. Five times over the next 2 years, Chopin and Liszt appeared together in public concerts, teaming up for four-hand sonatas, brilliant variations, and even Bach's Triple Concerto in D minor. So it was only natural for Chopin to invite Liszt over for his 1836 Soirée. After all, they were both living just north of the Boulevard des Italiens, less than a 10-minute walk from one another. And as we'll soon learn, they had many friends in common. Chopin's apartment at 38 Chaussée d'Antin was spacious and elegant. Guests were received by a servant who barely spoke French. This usually wasn't a problem for Chopin's visitors, so many of whom were Polish émigrés recently exiled in Paris after the disastrous November uprising against Russia. Besides Brzowski himself, the Poles present for Chopin's December 13th gathering were the aristocratic Potocki brothers, Albert Krzymała, a banker and one of Chopin's most trusted friends who would serve as his wingman for his developing relationship with Sand, and Dr. Jan Matuszynski, a physician and Chopin's most recent roommate, who would get married 8 days later with Chopin himself as the witness. The guest list also included several distinguished Frenchmen. There was the middle-aged Marquis de Custine, an aristocrat and travel writer who in 3 years would pen a notoriously scathing account of Tsarist Russia. Victor Schellcher, in his early 30s, was a Republican journalist and abolitionist who in 1848 would author the decree abolishing slavery in French colonies. Also there was the respectable Pierre-Antoine Berryer, a celebrated trial lawyer and political leader of the legitimist cause against the reigning King Louis-Philippe. Among the creative artists present was the writer Eugène Sue, whose massively popular serial novel The Mysteries of Paris would appear 8 years later. His 1841 book, Mathilde, introduced a now iconic proverb translated into English as, "Revenge is a dish best served cold." Besides Liszt, Chopin, and Brzowski, there were 2 other musicians in attendance. One was Adolphe Nourrit, the leading French singer of his generation and creator of roles in operas by Rossini, Auber, and Meyerbeer. Nourrit's 10-year reign as principal tenor of the Paris Opera would come to an end less than a year later, after he went hoarse during a performance, but for now he was still holding on to what was left of his golden voice. Then there was Johann Peter Pixis, a respected but outdated piano virtuoso who at 48 years old was the most senior of the group. Brzowski found that everything too much recalled that he was a German Viennese artist, and his crooked lips gave a strange character to his face. Nonetheless, out of all the Parisian pianists in those days, Liszt and Chopin must have liked Pixis well enough. They collaborated with him the next year in a grand set of piano variations called Hexameron. Finally, there were the ladies, both of whom appear in this well-known 1840 painting of Liszt at the piano. They were both novelists who wrote under male pseudonyms, and both romantically involved or interested in one of the 2 young pianist composers, Chopin and Liszt. But personality-wise, the 2 women could not have been more different. Countess Marie d'Agoult published her works under the name Daniel Stern, and had been Liszt's mistress for the last year. She scandalously left her husband, a count no less, and sacrificed her social position to live openly with Liszt. She would bear him 3 children, including Cosima, the future wife of Richard Wagner. Brzowski writes that she was a lively, coquettish blonde, in a dress of exquisite taste, engaging guests with playful, witty, and alluring conversation. At the other end of the spectrum was Georges Sand, born as Aurore Dupin. She was France's most famous woman of letters, notorious not only for her socially progressive novels, but also for numerous high-profile romances and her signature male attire, which at first prompted Chopin to ask if she was really a woman at all. Brzowski found Sand to be serious and cold, as if not French, with a rather lifeless physiognomy in which one could read only intellect, thought, and pride. Sand and Chopin had just met several weeks earlier in Marie d'Agoult's salon, thus beginning their slow but fateful courtship. Perhaps realizing that her first meeting with Chopin had not gone well, Sand chose this occasion to wear a fantastical costume in Poland's national colors. She spent the evening playing it cool, practically motionless, on a sofa by the fireplace, releasing puffs of smoke from a probably opium-laced cigar, and answering questions sparingly and solemnly. In her own strange way, she was flirting with Chopin. Brzowski continues, Groups soon formed and conversation became extremely animated. Liszt sustained it the most. His intelligence, acuity, wit, playful humor, and finally his eccentricity caused others to most willingly enter into discussions with him, from which he most often emerged victorious. Liszt was evidently a natural at being the center of attention, but the more reserved Chopin was a kind of social kryptonite for Liszt, or a fiery sword, as Brzowski called him. He explained, whenever the composer-poet, Chopin, aimed at the impassioned fantasist of the piano, Liszt, the shot was effective. Everyone was satisfied, and the humiliated artist, unable to mount a strong defense, attempted to cover up the defeat inflicted upon him. Brzowski tells us that Liszt often called Chopin Mazurka, a nickname he would shout repeatedly when he had nothing witty to say back. But soon Brzowski grew tired of the polite conversation, for I ardently wished to become acquainted with some of them from their main quality, their artistry, namely Liszt, whom I had not yet heard. Therefore, almost at my instigation, Chopin invited him to play the Sonata of Moscheles for 4 hands. There were few piano duet works of the time that could better display the artistry of both pianists. Moscheles was a famed virtuoso of the early 19th century, known for the sensational difficulty of his music, at least by 1810s and 20s standards. His E-flat major duet sonata had been a favorite of virtuosos like Chopin and Liszt for the last decade and a half. An 1820 reviewer praised it as a splendidly successful work, a true double sonata concertante in which neither of the two players are passive, but each performs independently, and with his neighboring friend goes hand in hand. And so the two artists sat down at the instrument, one made by Chopin's preferred manufacturer and friend, Pleyel, whose pianos had a light, nimble touch, a veiled sonority, and a silvery, ethereal treble. As always, Chopin took the secondo position at the bottom half of the keyboard, giving him full control of the inner voices and pedaling. Liszt took the primo, allowing him full license to display his flashy passage work and eclipse Chopin's smaller frame with his own dramatic profile. In this piece, both players had their work cut out for them, yet they probably had no reason to rehearse beforehand. They had already performed the same sonata together in public 2 years earlier at the Salle Pleyel to great success. Playing it again among friends would be no problem. Pixis duly sat beside the two younger virtuosos to turn pages. As they played, he kept looking back at Brzowski with admiration, as if to thank him for instigating the performance. The rest of the company listened attentively and quietly throughout. It's fun for us to imagine Chopin and Liszt playing this music just because of how different it is from their own compositions. And yet they seem to really enjoy playing it, as they did so in both public and private settings. 3 years later, Chopin played the sonata with its composer, Moscheles, for a royal French audience. The second movement, which is a simple theme with increasingly ornate variations, was encored by the Queen herself. The Adagio, which exists in both full and abbreviated versions, has a spacious, melancholic theme. Its serious character sets up a stark contrast with the humorous finale. This movement ends on the wrong chord, a B dominant seventh. It implies a finale in E major, but the sonata is in E flat, a half step lower. So the last movement sputters to life with an awkward, lurching modulation into the correct key. In a Haydn-esque twist, this mistake becomes part of the theme itself, developing through a series of delightfully wrong turns. So Chopin and Liszt managed to be witty not only in conversation, but also in their choice of music. After the sonata, which was warmly received, Chopin received his guests with ices, probably either ice cream or fruit sorbets, while Countess d'Agoult made tea. Georges Sand, fixed to the sofa, did not part with her cigar. When tea was finished, the celebrated tenor Nourrit began to sing. Accompanied by Liszt at the piano, he performed several works by Schubert, including Erlkönig and Die junge Nonne. At this time, Schubert's lieder were only just beginning to permeate French salons, partly with the help of Nourrit. As for Liszt, his curiosity went beyond the role of mere accompanist. The next year, he began working on 12 piano transcriptions of Schubert's songs, including both Die junge Nonne and the notoriously tense Erlkönig. The result was that one of the more terrifyingly difficult piano accompaniments ever written for a lead became a dramatic solo work. The charming evening came to an unceremonious close. Brzowski writes, "I very much wished to finally hear Liszt play by himself, but the virtuoso firmly refused, and instead began a philosophical dispute with Bernard Potocki, which had no end. The disputants became incredibly heated, and although others joined in their conversation, I saw that it bored most of those present. Chopin grew very impatient, the golden humor of Madame d'Agoult lost its luster, Georges Sand grew paler and her silent gaze became more gloomy, Pixis's lips twisted more from dissatisfaction, until finally the late hour interrupted the dispute, dispelling my hope of hearing Liszt and scattering the company. One by one, the illustrious guests left Chopin's salon, likely never to gather again in the same exact group. Just over 2 years later, Nourrit threw himself from the top floor of his hotel after the unbearable blow of losing his voice. Pixis's celebrity diminished as he retreated to a quiet life in the German spa town of Baden-Baden, where he taught piano until his death in 1874, by then a long-forgotten relic of a bygone era. Liszt continued to admire Chopin's music, but the feeling was not reciprocated. Chopin grew irritated by the excesses of Liszt's musicianship and personality, and the two grew apart as Liszt embarked on a continental tour the next year. Chopin and Sand finally became lovers in 1838. Their relationship would last, unlike that of Liszt and d'Agoult, the latter of whom became so jealous of Sand that she began openly mocking her by the 1840s. Despite having 3 children with d'Agoult, Liszt inevitably was unfaithful, and the two officially broke off their relationship by 1844. Few biographers of Chopin or Liszt have the luxury of recounting the minuscule details of this relatively inconsequential event. But in doing so, we discover a great deal about these artists, the illustrious company that Chopin attracted after 5 years of living in Paris, his co-performance with Liszt of a 4-hand sonata by a once respected but now forgotten composer, Liszt's early performances of Schubert's music, which led to his later piano transcriptions, the fateful early encounters of Chopin and Sand with their opposites attract dynamic, the fact that Chopin was an excellent host who served ice cream, and an illustration of his verbal sparrings with Liszt, who just couldn't shut up sometimes, and apparently ended the party because of it. Of course, Liszt didn't mention these details in his own memoir of Chopin, written more like a poetic fever dream than a realistic recollection. And so Brzowski's account is of value to us because of how naturally he depicted that evening. Just another day in the life of two rising Parisian musicians, mingling with some of the most influential and creative minds of their great city.